starting now. Welcome everyone. Welcome to Converse and welcome to session by Chris Hord. It's the MS-700 Managing Microsoft Teams exam prep. I'll hand over to Chris.
Thank you ever so much, Martin. It's absolutely fantastic to be here. I've been watching the conference for the last day, and there's been some truly terrific speakers. So welcome everyone, and thanks again to the organising team of Martin, Mark, and Randy. This session is about MS-700 Managing Microsoft Teams exam prep, and again, a thank you to all of the sponsors for being able to make this possible. I did the event at Comsverse in-store back in the Oxford Circus store a few months back. I'm really excited to be back. Now, this session today, there's going to be an absolutely packed session. We're going to start off and look at the MS-700 exam itself. We're then going to move at quite a fast pace through the topics because there is a lot to cover in this exam. And then for the last 10 minutes, we're going to be going through all the resources that are going to help you make a successful attempt at MS-700. So let's get to it. Let's start looking at what this exam is all about. So the Microsoft Teams Administrator exam, MS-700. We are doing this for many reasons, whether it is to verify the role that we do on a day-to-day basis, whether we aspire to be a Teams administrator, or whether we just have a passion for Teams and want to show our aptitude. There are many reasons to take this certification. This certification is an associate certification, so we have to understand what this certification is all about. It's an intermediate level role-based certification. In other words, it's like an MCSA. So if you've taken an MCSA before in the past, then it is the equivalent to that in the new Microsoft certification world. This sits between the Microsoft 365 Fundamentals and the Microsoft 365 Administrator Associate Expert. So it's right there in the middle, and you can see by the diagram that there are many different workloads such as security or modern desktop or teamwork. This one for Teams, and it's been out since November. Now, with a associate level certification, you need 6 to 12 months really of hands-on experience. You need to really have been doing the administrator job for a little bit of time. Of course, there is always stories of people going in and doing this exam just off the back of getting started, but really, if you're going to make a strong attempt to the exam, then Microsoft recommends 6 to 12 months worth of experience. Now, the fundamentals, do you have to do that before? No, that is not required, but it is recommended. Now, with the Team Administrator exam, the first thing to do is to read the audience profile, and that way we can deconstruct what Microsoft actually wants in order to be able to pass the exam. So if you actually, when booking, have a look at the audience profile, we can take a few things to help us understand what this exam is and what it isn't. So first of all, this exam is called Managing Microsoft Teams for a reason. It's about the all-up management of Teams on a day-to-day basis. In other words, every single day you should be getting hands-on with Teams, hands-on with the Teams Admin Center, and you will probably be in a role within your business that has the responsibility and the authority for managing Teams on a day-to-day basis. Secondly, from this description, this is an enterprise exam. It's an enterprise exam because it's going into functionalities that are based in Microsoft 365 SKUs like E5. It delves into things like advanced compliance, which are only available. So this is an exam that is really going to test the whole breadth of your knowledge to do with Teams. Thirdly, it's about lighting up all of the workloads and migrating off Skype for Business. So when we talk about workloads, we talk about things like chat and files and calling and meetings. You are going to be tested on all of them. You're also going to be tested on your ability to move away from Skype for Business and onto Microsoft Teams. It's been a big thing the last year. We know that Skype for Business is coming to an end in July 2021. So it's important that we can manage our customers to go from Skype for Business to Teams. And fourth, this is because it's about managing teams. There are many different ways to manage teams. So Microsoft is going to be looking for your ability to not only manage the GUI, the Teams Admin Center, but also to manage through the command line through PowerShell. In knowing what this exam is, we also have to understand what it's not. So this exam isn't about having expert knowledge on voice and having to know how to do the architecture, for example, of direct routing, knowing advanced networking principles, or knowing kind of advanced setup on things like Windows Virtual Desktop. So you do not have to worry about this exam going into very granular detail. Now, about an associate exam, because this is a Teams Administrator Associate. If you've never taken an associate exam before, or taken an old MCSA, when you come to taking the exam, there are about 40 to 60 questions in length. And some recommendations, as you can see here on the slide: try to answer all questions. There's no penalty for guessing. Some questions you may discover cannot be skipped and you have to ask on the spot, but most of all, don't get caught up on any of the questions, because you can click review, you can cycle through the questions and come back to others later. Now, those 40 to 60 exams, or 40 to 60 questions, they're going to be over the period of about 150 minutes in order to be able to answer them. So that's 2.5 hours. You get 30 minutes for all the instructions, and then once you're through the instructions, you have 2.5 hours to answer them. So then you're not such, I guess, time restricted like the fundamentals, but it still goes very, very quickly. For any of you who haven't taken the exam, a pass rate is 700 out of 1,000. Now, that's not 70% as such, but when we normally make recommendations as MCTs, we normally aim at getting 75 to 80% of the questions. And discussing the questions, this goes beyond multiple choice in an associate exam. You've got many different types of questions. You have build list, hot areas, drag and drop questions. It's really recommended, if you see that little link there on the screen, to make a note of that link, because they'll take you through to a Microsoft article that will explain all the different types of questions. And that's why one of the resources at the end discusses the official practice test. And if you haven't taken an exam, I would really advise to do that. And normally in an associate exams and above, we have the case studies. So you will be expected to go and take a real world scenario where you have paragraphs of information, tables, a real world scenario of implementing Teams with defined business and technical requirements. You have to synthesize all that information, and then you have to answer the questions based off the back of that. Associate exams typically have between 1 to 3 case studies, and since last year, you may have performance-based labs too. So that's why you can no longer, I guess, revise and then just go ahead and take the exam. You need absolutely to get hands-on with this. How do you take the exam? Well, the location is either proctored, you can take it at your home or office, or you can take it in a test center. Now, being with the situation with COVID-19, the test centers and Pearsons are generally closed, so proctor is kind of the only option at this moment in time. But whether you take it now or whether you take them when the test centers reopen, do what feels right for you. Exams can be booked outside of working hours, so you know, if you want to do it in the evening at home, you can do. But what's most important is, before sitting that exam, to make sure you run through your technical checks. Now, some insider's tip about this MS-700 exam: plan for the day. Okay, if you're going to book it in 3 weeks' time, plan right up to that time in terms of your learning activities. We find that people who do this, almost like training for a boxing match or an athletic event, so to speak, have a lot better chance than just kind of leaving it all to the last minute. Sleep and eat well, arrive early so you're on time, and take away all of that pressure. Secondly, that defined learning strategy: identify how you learn best. At the end section, when we talk about resources, there's going to be a lot of different types of resources depending upon your learning style. So ask yourself the question, how do you learn best? And take a multitude of these resources in the run up to the exam. Third, have an exam strategy. When you go in, if you've taken Microsoft exams before and you've had strategies that work out, use them. If you haven't, do the official practice test, get some experience, and then take that experience and go in with a strategy. Don't simply do the questions one after another and then end up stalling. Don't end up rushing them and leaving them all to the last hour. And most all important, read the question and don't anticipate outside the question. It's a big problem with Microsoft exam takers, is that they tend to think of their real life as opposed to reading in the question. Microsoft doesn't try to throw you any curveballs or trick questions. Everything you need to answer it is right there in the question. And number four, be the audience profile, be the person that Microsoft is aiming for in that exam description. What I mean about that is you have to put yourself in the position as the team's administrator inside your organization. You work for an enterprise and you follow Microsoft Docs, Microsoft Learn, and Microsoft best practices to the letter. If you can do that, you go in with the right mindset. Microsoft are testing you on Teams. You are the team's administrator. You suspend what you do in real life for a moment. Now, with the challenges in specific about MS-700, the Microsoft Teams exam, I've worked with many people on this. I've written a blog, which I'll share with you at the end. There is some challenges. I took this exam in beta. It had a few surprises. I'm happy to say that I passed, but my experience and talking to other people, it's important to go into exams with your eyes open. So what are the challenges in particular with MS-700? What catches people out and makes them have, it degrades their performance in the exam? Well, the first is that candidates don't anticipate how much of the exam is to do with calling. When you put in calling and when you take networking into account, it can be up to 30% of the exam questions, which is quite high. There is a lot of people that I know that use Teams but do not use the audio conferencing add-on, the calling plans, or the phone system. You are at a natural disadvantage if you do not accommodate onto these things. But even though there is a lot of questions on calling, those mainly refer to calling plans as opposed to direct routing. But if you haven't engaged with calling today, start today. You can do so in demos.microsoft.com accounts, or you can ask your business to go away and add these additional SKUs for a period of time so you can get hands-on and make a better shot at the exam. Secondly, this is an enterprise exam. We explained this before, but it has the E5 functionality and you do have questions on it. So when we think of Teams advanced compliance functionality, things like information barriers and DLP and supervision, they will be there. You will be tested on these. Now, some candidates have never ever had E5 or leveraged that functionality. Again, demos.microsoft.com. If you've got access to that as a Microsoft partner, for example, then you can spin up an E5 subscription and get hands-on with this. You may have to also go back to your business and ask them for an E5 license in order to be able to leverage and get hands-on with the functionality. Number three, know the Teams admin center inside out. Every submenu, nothing in is redundant. You get questions across the whole of that Teams admin center. So know every policy, know every setting within it. Get to know things like call park policies, get to know things like messaging or meetings or calling policies, get to know the org-wide settings. But even though I recommend to know the Teams admin center inside out, Teams isn't just managed in that Teams admin center. Get to know the Office 365 Security and Compliance Center, get to know Azure AD, and get to know the SharePoint Admin Center, because across the exam, you will need to go into those places and know how to configure settings. So we've had a quick all-up look at the exam. I want you to be able to go in with your eyes open. Now, for the kind of the large part of this session, we're going to have a look at the topics. Now, these topics are broken down into 3 parts. So there's 14 topics in all. The first part is to plan and configure a Microsoft Teams environment. We need to know how to go and set this up either for our organization or for our customers. And you can see this covers things like being able to move from Skype to Business to Teams, how to configure network settings, how to manage security and compliance. That takes up the big part of the exam, 45 to 50%. So in an associate exam, you'll be looking at 18 to 30 questions around those areas. Moving on to part 2, manage chat, calling and meetings. The second part of this exam is all about the workloads. So this is all about managing chat, managing meetings and managing calling, 30 to 35%. And in the exam, you can expect 12 to 21 questions on that. Thirdly, it's all about managing teams and managing app policies. So being able to control apps is a big part of Microsoft Teams in order for security and compliance reasons, but also because of the user experience. That is 20 to 25%. So you'll get 8 to 15 questions. In my experience and speaking to others, the most questions you would have in the, I guess, the top end from the example would be about 60. The lowest that I've kind of seen is around about 43. So expect to have that amount of questions over your 2.5 hours. Let's go into each of the topics. So starting off in the first section, plan and configure a Microsoft Teams environment. In layman's terms, this is how to fully move onto Teams, to move to what we call Teams only configuration, where the organization is only using Microsoft Teams. And what Microsoft needs you to know is to choose an appropriate upgrade path in coexistence mode, to plan and troubleshoot meeting migrations. They're going to ask you to configure Microsoft Teams upgrade notifications and meeting app choices, and to configure coexistence mode for the organization and per user. So knowing how to move fully onto Teams, the keys to this I've put down the bottom. The first is understanding those coexistence modes. There are several coexistence modes, including Skype for Business only, islands where the organization uses Skype for Business and Teams together, and Teams only where they're all using Microsoft Teams. Get to know them. Now, the difficulty with this one in terms of getting hands-on with this is that if you've recently deployed Teams tenants, then they're already going to be in Teams only mode and you don't need to do anything. So docs.com is really your friend in this given situation, because on docs.com there are several articles over all of the coexistence modes explaining what each of them does. Of course, you might engage with customers who are still using Skype for Business or in islands mode. You might have some that has already set themselves to Skype for Business only. But you need to know all of those things. You need to know what in the inter-op modes are. You need to know what meetings firsts are. So secondly, another key to this is understanding where to manage those coexistence modes. So that is in the Teams admin center, as you can see in the picture in the top right. So if I just dive into my admin center and you go to org-wide settings and you go to Teams upgrade, you can see that this is a new tenant. So I will not have to take any actions. But if you have an organization that is in another one of those coexistence modes, you will have the ability to set a coexistence mode in the Teams admin center. You would also know that you can do this in PowerShell too. So these are some of the key PowerShell commands that you will need to know. Get CS Teams upgrade policy, because if you are changing users or you're changing the organization to Teams only, you can do that in PowerShell in addition to doing that in the Teams admin center. And thirdly, I would advise to understand how to use the meeting migration service. Now, the meeting migration service can be used in conjunction with upgrading the Teams to Teams only, but understand the scenarios with that. So we have to know how to move our organization to Teams. A combination of docs.com, the Teams admin center, and understanding these key PowerShell commands should be enough in this part. So we move on to part 2, to plan and configure network settings for Microsoft Teams. Microsoft are going to ask you to plan for successful network deployment using the network planner, how to calculate bandwidth capacity for voice, video, meetings, and live events. This section is basically how to optimize connectivity and performance for Microsoft Teams. We need to have a basic understanding to do this. So the keys to this is to really understand how Teams works best from a networking perspective. If you ever go, so there'll be several sessions on this during Comsverse, but if you ever go to a Microsoft webinar on Teams where it talks about networking, it will say that Teams is optimized if a user connects directly to the internet, because it can get to the Azure front door and then use and leverage Microsoft's network for best performance. There are so many organizations that are still have things set up to be able to go over their WAN, and they're backhauling all their traffic. We need to understand how we can rectify that situation. Now, then, that again is on the docs.com documentation. Secondly, we need to understand ports and protocols. What are the ports that audio use? What are the ports that video use? What are the general ports that need to be open? Is it TCP? Is it UDP? Again, docs.com is very good for laying out all the ports and protocols that you need. And thirdly, there are 2 tools that Microsoft are calling out in this section. The first is the Network Planner, and the second is the Network Testing Companion. Now, the Network Planner is available to you in the Teams Admin Center. If we come into this section, Planning, and then we have the Network Planner, you can come and set out a network plan for your users. So if we just dig into this network plan here, okay, and click on, you can see all the information for our users. And by setting out that plan, we know how much bandwidth the Teams is going to need for our users. In addition, the Network Testing Companion, you may be familiar with it from Skype for Business. If you do a quick search in a browser for Microsoft Teams Network Testing Companion, you can go and download that, and that performs network quality and connectivity tests. As a final point on this section, okay, it says to configure media optimizations for using QoS. It's really important that within the Teams Admin Center, that if you come up to meetings, and I think it's in the meeting settings, so we're just going to wait for this to fire up. We need to know that we can mark our packets for QoS, so that by marking the packets, we can work with our network administrators to be able to prioritize that traffic. Section 3, implement governance and the lifecycle management for Microsoft Teams. This is basically saying, how do I standardize Teams and manage the life and the death of a team? Lifecycle is really I love this term. It is basically saying the birth, the life and the death of something. So how do we manage teams from when we create them all the way through to when we're deleting or archiving them, and how do we standardize those teams as opposed to having to create bespoke teams each and every time? Well, the keys to this is to understand how to create Teams templates. First of all, that is the first objective of this topic. Now, Teams templates, you may have heard Microsoft Build, the announcement about Teams templates. Those team templates are on the roadmap and coming down the line. We've had Teams templates that you can create via the Graph API for some time, and those are the templates that are being referred to at this time in the exam. Now, some of you may not get hands-on with the Graph API every day, but the docs.com articles, okay, will guide you through how to create those via the Graph API. So if you want to test that in your environment, then I would heavily recommend it, because you might get 1 or 2 questions on that. Secondly, we have to understand how to configure Microsoft 365 group policies in Azure AD. You can see here, set up policies for Office 365 group creation, configure Office 365 for classification, expiration, and naming policies. Teams are based on Office 365 or what's now called Microsoft 365 groups. So we have to understand the relationship between teams and Microsoft 365 groups and the architecture of a team. So when we create a team, we create a SharePoint site, we create a mailbox, we also create a Microsoft 365 group. So we can actually configure these classifications, these expiration and naming policies. We can't actually do that through the Teams Admin Center. So what we actually do is we actually go into Azure Active Directory. So you'll see this just firing up here. Just going to wait for that to load. Click on Azure Active Directory. Click on our groups, and here you can see that here are our groups, and we have our expiration policies, and we have our naming policies. I would also recommend in this understanding how to be able to restrict the creation of groups as well, which you can see from many blogs on the internet. I think Microsoft also do an article on docs.com too. Finally, we need to understand how to archive, restore, and delete a team. Now we can do that in Teams, we can do that in a Teams Admin Center. I'm just going to come back to my environment. So I'm in a Teams Admin Center. If I go to Teams and I go to manage my teams, you can see here that if I was to highlight one of my teams, I can archive or delete straight through the Admin Center. I can also do this in Teams itself. So if I was to come down to the cog next to join or create a team, okay, I can archive that team or I can delete it. This is a really important part of getting to understand, because implementing this governance, implementing when teams are created, how long they exist for, and when they are deleted is a really important time, because issues of team sprawl has been rampant across Microsoft Teams and all organizations for some time. Number 4, configuring and managing guest access. Guests, you are allowing to access resources in your tenant. This part is all about asking, how do I manage people outside my organization who I give tenant access to? So you're going to be expected to know how to configure guest users, how to configure guest permissions, how to configure meeting, messaging, and calling options for guests, amongst other things. So this is all about this section, guest management. So we need to understand how to configure guest access in the Teams Admin Center. If I come up and I come to the Teams Admin Center and I go to the org-wide settings, you will see here that this section largely kind of surrounds this. So we can turn guest access on or off, and I can, through this section, have my calling, my meetings, and my messaging options as regards guests inside my environment. But we also need to understand and configure how we configure guests, users in a team, and how to add and remove. So I can do that in 2 ways. I can do that either through Teams itself, or I can do that through Azure AD. So going inside my test environment, here I am within Teams. I can understand that if I add a member, I can add guests through this. I can also remove guests. So if I come into click on the more actions and manage teams, I can also remove guests in this way too. But I can also, in Azure AD, if I go to users, okay, I can also add guests through Azure AD. So it's important that you know both ways in order to how to add and how to remove guests. In addition, you have this thing called managing Azure AD access reviews. So an access review, if I come to in Azure Active Directory and I go to my groups, okay, you can set up access reviews on your Microsoft 365 groups, which is therefore on your teams, and you can ensure that people who are supposed to be in that team are supposed to be in that team, whether that applies to members or whether that applies to guests. Now, this exam doesn't at the moment go into the idea of entitlement, but you will need to know about access reviews. Number 5, managing the security and compliance. So we need to understand about Microsoft Teams admin roles. So those admin roles, as you can see on the right hand side, are the role-based access control. We need to know, not only know what those roles are, but we need to know the responsibilities they cover. We need to then, in security and compliance, understand what retention and sensitivity policies are, how we configure security and compliance alerts, information barriers, and security reports. The 3 keys to this section, as said, are understanding the RBAC roles. Now, the RBAC roles are accessible. If I come into the 365 Admin Center, I can then set these roles for my users, but it's docs.com that will actually outline the responsibilities of what each role does. So whether they're the all-up team service admin or whether they're the 3 derivatives of that, all to do with voice, it's important to understand what they are and what they do. Know how to apply that through the Microsoft 365 portal, know how to apply that through Azure AD. Secondly, a big tip for this section, in order to be able to know how to apply retention and sensitivity labels, is to understand the Office 365 Security and Compliance Center. So if you saw me through Microsoft 365, click Security. So through the Security section, you can see it comes into the Office 365 Security and Compliance. Here we can understand how to set up data loss prevention, how to set up retention, how to be able to generate reports. All of this section, get to know the Office 365 Security and Compliance portal very well. The last is to understand information barriers. You have to understand the concept of scoped directory search and how to implement information barriers with PowerShell. It's probably one of the most, I guess, technical parts how to do this. So grab yourself a demo tenant, follow the instructions on docs.com and set it up with inside the environment. I'm sure you'll get 1 or 2 questions on that. Second to last in this section, deploy and manage Microsoft Teams endpoints. You'll be expected to know how to deploy clients to devices, including to Windows, VDI, Mac OS, and mobile devices. I think that you will probably have quite a bit of experience of this already, but just so that you know, you can download them. So if you were to literally open a browser search and put in the Microsoft Teams client, there is a web page in order to be able to download them. I'm sure you know how to download apps for iOS and Android from the App Store. Understand how Microsoft Teams is packaged into Pro Plus and understand how to deploy it onto VDI environments. Secondly, understand how to add configuration profiles for phones and collaboration bars. This is, I guess, in a way, a sort of template in itself for the configuration of your devices. And you can find that out in the Teams Admin Center. So if I jump into the Teams Admin Center and I come up here to devices and to phones, or if I click collaboration bars, you can see on the right hand side, I've got the configuration profiles. I select add, and I can create these profiles that I assign to each phone in my organization to not only standardize their settings, but to also ensure that there's firmware updates. To note, Microsoft Teams Rooms and configuration profiles for Teams Rooms is something that's coming in the future, and it isn't in the Teams Admin Center yet and isn't covered within this exam. But you do need to understand how you need to set up Microsoft Team Rooms. You need to understand all about the resource accounts. You need to understand how, and docs.com again is, I would recommend, because it has almost like a walkthrough in how to configure it. The problem is with the Microsoft Teams Rooms is that you may not have ever seen one or got hands-on. They are expensive too. They're about £1,500–2,000. So whether you've actually experienced it or not, that's why docs.com is really recommended here. And lastly in this section is to monitor and analyze the service usage. We need to interpret Microsoft Teams reports, Microsoft 365 usage reports, call analytics, and call quality dashboard. Now, this is quite an easy section because they're all easy and within reach. So if I go into my Teams Admin Center, you will see the reporting, so analytics and reports. So you'll see all the usage reports, understand all these reports, understand what they do. In the Microsoft Teams Admin Center, you will also see this section, reports. So this is what the one that's covered in the exam, which is the usage report for Microsoft Teams. So you select a report and you will see Microsoft Teams to cover user activity and device usage. In terms of call analytics, if we go to users within inside your environment, so I'm just, let me pick a user. So this is just going to fire up. Let me pick Adam. And then you can see the call history. If you've got a call history there, you'll be able to see the call analytics that are there. Okay. And in terms of the call quality dashboard, okay, let's see if I can fire this up. The call quality dashboard is right down the bottom of the Teams Admin Center. It'll take you out to another screen for you to be able to analyze. So those are really the 4 key parts of the reporting. I would also recommend to understand per team and cross-channel analytics within Teams as well. So in Teams, if I'm actually in Microsoft Teams and I go down and I manage my team, okay, you can see the section analytics. I would also recommend to understand this too. I've heard that there's a few questions related to that. So between the Teams Admin Center and the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, if you've got the calling plans added, you should be all set. Moving quickly now onto the second section, which is this is the workload section. So the managing chat, calling and meetings. The first of that section is probably the most technical at all. These, I would say, are fairly straightforward. The next kind of 2 parts of the exam. Managing chat, calling and meetings is really understanding how to configure messaging policies in the Teams Admin Center, org-wide settings, and how to configure external access for files. Those, if you understand how to do those 3 things, then I would think that the managing chat and collaboration experiences is very straightforward. So configure the messaging policy. If we go to our Teams Admin Center, it's a defined section here in the messaging policies. We need to understand this concept of org-wide default policy and the fact that we can then add and customize our own policies. But if I dig into the global org-wide, these are all the settings in order to be able to chat. So that is a big part of this section. The org-wide settings in terms of how to configure your team settings. So this is all up settings across your whole environment, your ability to tag, the ability to email channels, the ability to set external and guest access or build resource accounts. Get to know each particular section. Understand also as well about the external access through the SharePoint Admin Center. Teams are built upon SharePoint and OneDrive in terms of sharing files. So if I was to jump into the SharePoint Admin Center and then I go, okay, to policies and sharing, we need to understand about this ability to be able to externally share, because it's a prerequisite for working in Teams. The second section about the meeting experiences is like the first with chat, but this is all about meetings and the functionality we want for our customers within meetings. We need to understand how to configure meetings in the Teams Admin Center and via PowerShell, how to configure live events, and how to set up and configure audio conferencing. Now, this is a really great, because this is all the Teams Admin Center now. If I go into the Teams Admin Center, it's this section here. So you can see conference bridges, our meeting policies and settings, our live events policies and settings. This section of the exam is all to do with this section here. So you need to know how to come into a conference bridge and be able to turn off, for example, like, so if I go to the bridge settings, how to turn off meeting entry and exit notifications. How in a meeting policy, so let's just fire up this meeting policy, I can turn off the Outlook add-in or turn off cloud recording so that when we have our meetings, people can't record in the meetings. We need to understand this. Last about this section is you need to understand PowerShell, you need to understand these PowerShell commands down the bottom. Teams meeting policy, Teams meeting broadcast policy, which refers to live events. Thirdly, managing phone numbers. So with managing phone numbers, this is going into calling. We need to know how we can manage our phone numbers within Microsoft Teams. We need to know how we can order them, how we can manage them, how we can add them to users, how we can add and remove an emergency address. Basically, how do you get people set up for calling to landline and mobiles using that PSTN functionality with the calling plans? So understand how Teams connects to PSTN via calling plans or direct routing. We need to know if we're using Microsoft or if we intend to bring our own phone system. Secondly, understand the types of numbers supported by Teams. So we need to understand things like service numbers, toll numbers, and toll-free numbers. Docs.com provides some really good information around that. And thirdly, understand how to add emergency addresses for your organization. So this is in the Teams admin center. Okay, if we go to locations and being able to set up an emergency address, we also have to understand about when it comes to numbers. So if I go to voice and I come to phone numbers, if we're adding numbers from new, or if we have to put in port requests, or there is also a request form for completely new numbers. So there are different ways, to acquire those numbers. In terms of managing phone system, this is all about phone system functionality and what we can do with it. You need to understand the ability to create auto attendance and call queues, call park policies, or calling policies. Again, this is a fairly self-contained section within inside the Teams admin center. We have here under voice our ability to create call queues, our ability to create call plans, and these are the policies it's on about in this section: the call park, the calling, and the caller ID policies. We need to understand how to build that auto attendant and build that call queue. I would also recommend looking at such things like how to configure voicemail, how to configure secondary ringer within Teams, how to configure things like group call pickup. These aren't explicitly mentioned, but I would try to find out as much as possible about the functionalities of calling. There should again be some good sessions here in Commsverse that can help you get underway. And if you haven't got it today, again, I can't recommend this enough. Use demos.microsoft.com because you can add calling licenses on, or go and back to the business and say, I need this in order to make a successful attempt at my exam. It might also be good if your business is thinking to go ahead and do a proof of concept, which you can double use that for this exam too. Now, the last section, the shortest one, are managing teams and acts policies. The first is managing the team, being able to create a team, being able to upgrade an existing resource to a team. So upgrading a Microsoft 365 group, or upgrading a teamifying a SharePoint site, managing privacy levels for a team, and managing org-wide teams. This is fairly 101 stuff. In layman's, what teams should we have? How can we create these from existing groups and SharePoint sites? So we need to understand these real 101 things, like the differences between a private team, a public team, and an org-wide team. We need to understand in Teams where we can create them. So down the bottom, join and create. We're in the Teams admin center through Teams, and then manage teams. I can create teams there. I can also, of course, create teams through PowerShell with commands such as new -team or get, remove -team. And we need to understand how, as said, to teamify the Microsoft 365 group. So within inside the Teams, the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, if I go to active, or should I say groups, and then groups, if I've got a team, you can see the team status that is right next to the Microsoft 365 group. So I've got a new group here. I click on this button, okay. Microsoft Teams. I can then create a team based off an existing Microsoft 365 group. Exactly the same way that I'm in a SharePoint site, and down the left-hand side, if it hasn't got an associate team, you should see a notification to be able to add a team to that SharePoint site. You need to know how to set up and configure org-wide teams. So you need to basically know how to do these things in Teams itself, in the Teams Admin Center, or via PowerShell. It doesn't, and I haven't seen anyone, any questions around being able to do this via the Graph API yet. I don't think it's covered specifically in this exam. Second to last, manage membership of a team. We need to understand how to manage users in a team, configure dynamic membership of teams, and manage access review. Now, we've already seen about how to do those access reviews in Azure AD, but this section is all about who should be part of a team. So we need to understand how to add and remove team members. We need to understand how to do that within Teams, within the Admin Center, or within inside PowerShell. Secondly, we need to understand how to change groups from static to dynamic membership in Azure AD. So again, having a good understanding of Azure AD and knowing where this is actually done to be able to change it to a dynamic group is important. Thirdly, understand how to create access reviews in Azure AD, which we already touched on earlier. This gives you another reason to go in today and start using access reviews if you have the right licensing. Now, down on the right hand side again, I've tried to create the, where I have seen or other people have seen PowerShell commands used in this exam, get to know how to add team users, how to get team users, so you list the users in a team, or how to remove team users. And finally, how to implement policies for Microsoft Teams apps. So this is all about app permission policies or app setup policies. I was actually quite surprised that there was about 4 or 5 questions in my exam on app permissions and app setup policies. We need to understand how to create, modify, and remove app permission policies in the Teams Admin Center, how to create, modify, and remove app setup policies in the Teams Admin Center, and how to allow or block apps. This is pure Teams Admin Center because it's the only section where these policies are able to be modified, I believe, at present. So if I'm in here inside the Teams Admin Center, go to Teams Apps, go to, first of all, the permission policies. Just going to load up the permission policies here. Again, like the messaging policies and like the meeting policies, you have the global org-wide default that's applied by default. So if you just want one policy across your whole organization, this one is you can use. If not, and you only wanted to apply a certain set of permissions to users, you would create another custom policy. But let's have a look inside the global org-wide default. This allows me to show all of the Microsoft apps in Teams, all the third-party apps. I think there's something in the region of about 400, and allows all custom apps too. So you need to understand the settings and how we can allow specific apps or block specific apps or block all apps. These permission policies define what apps users have access to. The app setup policies, on the other hand, are what they see down the left-hand rail within Teams. So I'm just going to click inside the app setup policy, and here we need to know how we can add apps, how we can allow pinning, and how we can allow users to upload those custom apps. I would also throw in, for good measure, how to simply at one click block or allow specific apps inside your environment. I would also cover and get an understanding of the org-wide app settings, which allow you to be able to upload things like Power Apps at the current time. So that's a whiz through the topics. Will be about another 2 to 3 minutes just as we discuss the resources and what can get you going from this point. I hope that I've managed to introduce you and get you start thinking about and thinking, well, hey, this doesn't look so difficult after all. There's a bunch of resources to help you at this stage. The first is Microsoft Learn. If you haven't seen Microsoft Learn, here's the link up the top. If you just simply put Microsoft Learn in a browser, you can get to this section through the exam page too. You've got 2 learning paths, which is 10 modules and 5 hours of content. This is official Microsoft content. It's regularly refreshed and it's completely 100% free. Now, it doesn't cover everything in the exam, probably about, I would say, 25 to 30%, but it is there for you to be able to brush up, and it will ask you questions. Secondly, the official practice test by Measure Up. I can't emphasize enough how important this is if you haven't taken a Microsoft exam. I usually do it so that I set myself 2 weeks before the exam, and I do the official practice test every day to get my mind in the headspace for the kind of questions they're going to ask me, and in terms of the kind of the subject areas. This has exam style questions. It's a question pool of about 150 to 180 questions, and it's written by subject matter experts. This is all about simulating the exam. You can deconstruct the questions. If you get them wrong, go back and find out why you got them wrong and improve your learning. Like I said, it's like training for a boxing match or an athletics track event. Set yourself some practice time beforehand. Also, as well, there are exam prep guides. I've written an exam prep guide at microsoft365pro.co.uk that people have used and told me they've passed, but so has Tom Arbonot, and so has Vlad Katranescu. All three of us are subject matter experts. Vlad and myself at MCTs, we've all passed. We all did it in the beta, and we are trying to take our insights and give them to you and try to point you at the docs articles and the Microsoft Learn articles that we used in order to be able to go ahead and have a successful outcome. So you can go to our sites, you can pick this up today, 100% free again. But there's loads of other additional resources. Docs.com really is the font of all knowledge when it comes to Teams. You have the CDX platform, demos.microsoft.com, where if you're a Microsoft partner, spin up an E5 subscription and get hands-on today. In addition, there are lots of great MCTs that are providing the IoT courses. So I think they're 3 or 4 days for MS-700. We have MCTs like Sarah Fenner here in the UK. She does these courses. If you want to sit down and go online for 3 or 4 days to deep dive through this content, then that is available today. You have the public video platforms such as YouTube or Udemy or Pluralsight. You have the MS-700 book that it should be available on Amazon roundabout now. But you can also reach out and ask somebody as well to mentor. There are a lot of community people who are willing to help, me included, to help you get a successful result and help you get to where you need to go. So returning to the outcomes, we've talked about the exam. We've gone and had a look at all the topics. I have also tried to provide you all kind of several resources with which for you to take away. I hope you've made some notes and that after the conference you will go ahead and start thinking about taking that MS-900 exam. The last thing for me to say really is the best of luck. I really hope that this is going to start you on your journey. Please use the blogs. Please use, if you can get your hands on it, the CDX platform, demos.microsoft.com, because and use the official practice tests. I would say those 3 things are really the main ones to get hands on today. But best of luck. I would like to thank you ever so much for coming along to my session. The survey link is on the screen. Please feel free to go along. I hope that you've had a great session and that you've got a lot out of it for taking the time to come and see me today.
Okay, thanks, Chris. We are out of time. So there is a breakout, which is BRK227, where people can go and join you.
That's awesome.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you very much. Take care.